Alexander Blackwood stood at the edge of the helipad atop the Blackwood Tower, 67 stories above Manhattan. The late September breeze carried the faint scent of the Hudson River as it tousled his meticulously styled chestnut hair. His Italian leather shoes reflected the golden light of the setting sun as he surveyed the cityscape that had become his kingdom, a modern-day empire of glass, steel, and digital innovation. At 35, Alexander had transformed a college dorm room invention into Blackwood Technologies, a company valued at $38 billion. The New York skyline before him was punctuated with buildings bearing his name, yet none of that compared to what awaited him in 3 days' time. He closed his eyes, feeling the cool metal of the platinum watch Claire had given him for their first anniversary against his wrist. The timepiece was elegant in its simplicity, much like Claire herself. The memory of her giving it to him resurfaced with vivid clarity. Her eyes, the color of rain-washed jade, sparkling with anticipation. The slight tremble in her fingers as she fastened it around his wrist. The way she'd kissed him afterward, soft and sweet, tasting of the champagne they'd been drinking. "Mr. Blackwood," came the crisp voice of Eliza, his chief of staff, interrupting his reverie. "The helicopter is ready for departure. Miss Edwards is waiting at the vineyard, and Chef Marcel has confirmed the 7-course tasting menu for the rehearsal dinner is prepared." Alexander opened his eyes and turned, offering Eliza a smile that transformed his normally serious face. At work, he was known for his intensity, his unyielding standards, his strategic brilliance. Only a small circle, Claire chief among them, knew of his quiet generosity, his unexpected bursts of humor, his vulnerability in the face of genuine emotion. "Thank you, Eliza. Has the new ring arrived from Cartier?" he asked, patting the inner pocket of his tailored Tom Ford jacket. "Delivered this morning, sir. I placed it in your briefcase myself." Unlike the first engagement ring, a flawless 5-carat diamond that society pages had described as befitting the future Mrs. Blackwood, this one had been designed with Claire's aesthetic in mind. She hadn't complained about the original, but Alexander had seen the fleeting shadow cross her face when she'd first laid eyes on it. As the head curator at the Whitney Museum of American Art, Claire Edwards had an eye for understated elegance, for beauty that whispered rather than shouted. He'd spent hours with the jeweler, personally selecting each element, a 2-carat oval diamond set in platinum, with delicate pave stones along the band that subtly formed the constellation under which they'd first met, Cassiopeia, visible in the night sky during the autumn charity gala, where Claire, fresh from graduate studies at École du Louvre in Paris, had captivated him not with false flattery, but with a scathing critique of his art collection. "You have the money to acquire significance, but not the discernment to recognize it," she'd told him that night. Amber liquid swirling in her glass as her free hand gestured toward a particularly expensive piece on his gallery wall. Her cocktail dress, vintage Dior in midnight blue, had shimmered under the chandelier light as she delivered her unvarnished assessment. Instead of taking offense, Alexander had been intrigued. "Teach me," he'd said simply, and meant it. 2 years later, after countless museum visits, passionate debates about Kandinsky versus Klee, and slow walks through rain-soaked Parisian streets discussing Rodin, he couldn't imagine life without her challenging presence, her unflinching honesty, her tender heart that she protected as fiercely as he guarded his own. "Will that be all, sir?" Eliza asked, tablet in hand, already moving on to the next item on her meticulously maintained schedule. "Yes, thank you. I'll see you at the rehearsal dinner." As Eliza retreated, Alexander took one final moment to appreciate the view. From this height, the city appeared manageable, each problem solvable, every obstacle surmountable. It was a perspective he had earned through years of calculated risks and visionary decisions. In 3 days, he would marry the woman who had taught him that true wealth lay not in what you possessed, but in whom you cherished. The helicopter's rotors were already spinning when he emerged onto the helipad, the downwash creating a vortex that pulled at his clothes. His pilot, Marcus, a former military man who had flown for Alexander for 7 years, gave a perfunctory nod as he approached. "Evening, sir. Weather's clear to Westchester. Should be a smooth 20-minute flight to the estate." Alexander settled into the plush leather seat, securing his seatbelt before donning the noise-canceling headset. Through the window, he watched as Manhattan receded, the buildings shrinking until they resembled an architect's model. He pulled out his phone, swiping to the photo Claire had sent that morning. A selfie taken in the Vineyard's guest house, where tradition dictated they spend the night before the wedding apart. She was smiling, her usually perfectly styled copper hair tousled from sleep, no makeup, wearing one of his old Harvard t-shirts. T-3 days until I make you the happiest man alive, read the caption. His thumb traced the outline of her face on the screen. Claire had entered his life like a revelation, the antithesis to the carefully calculated ambition that had defined his existence. Where he was strategic, she was spontaneous. Where he sought control, she embraced serendipity. Their differences had initially seemed insurmountable, yet over time they had become the very foundation of their bond. Alexander was drafting a response when the helicopter shuddered violently, the steady whump of the rotors faltering. His head snapped up, meeting Marcus's suddenly alert gaze through the cockpit doorway. "Sir, we're experiencing some mechanical issues." Marcus's voice crackled through the headset, professional calm belying the gravity of his words. "I'm going to attempt an emergency landing." Before Alexander could respond, the craft lurched again, tilting at a sickening angle. Through the window, he could see they were over the densely wooded area that separated the city from his Westchester estate. No roads, no clearings, nowhere to safely land. "Mayday, mayday," Marcus was saying into his radio, his voice growing more urgent. "Black Tech 1 experiencing catastrophic mechanical failure. Coordinates." The rest of his words were lost as the helicopter plummeted, spinning wildly. Alexander gripped the armrests, his knuckles white, as centrifugal force pressed him against the seat. Time seemed to both accelerate and slow, each second stretching into infinity while events unfolded with unstoppable momentum. In those suspended moments between sky and earth, Alexander's mind flooded with images. Claire laughing as she pulled him into the rain in Paris, declaring that Monet should be experienced in the same weather that inspired him. The first time he'd seen her cry, when discussing her mother's battle with early-onset Alzheimer's. The way she slept, curled against him like a question mark seeking an answer. Then came the impact, a deafening crash followed by the screech of metal against wood. Alexander was thrown forward against his restraints, then sideways as the helicopter rolled down an embankment. Glass shattered, metal twisted, and a searing pain erupted at the base of his spine before darkness claimed him completely. His return to consciousness came in fragments, the metallic taste of blood in his mouth, the distant wail of sirens, voices urgent but indistinct, the peculiar absence of sensation below his waist. "He's here. I've got a survivor," someone shouted, followed by the crackle of a radio and the crunch of boots on broken glass. Alexander tried to speak, to ask about Marcus, but could only manage a groan. A face appeared in his narrowing field of vision, a young paramedic, her features taut with professional concern. "Mr. Blackwood, stay with me. We're going to get you out of here." He wanted to ask about his legs, why he couldn't feel them, but the darkness was returning, more insistent this time, swallowing his consciousness despite his desperate desire to remain awake. The next time Alexander opened his eyes, it was to the rhythmic beeping of hospital monitors and the antiseptic smell of a private room at New York Presbyterian. The diffused afternoon light filtering through partially closed blinds suggested he had lost significant time. He tried to move, only to be met with a concerning absence of response from his lower body. "Alex?" The voice was hoarse, fragile, so unlike Claire's usual, confident tone that he might not have recognized it had he not immediately turned to see her. She sat in a chair pulled close to his bedside, her normally immaculate appearance in disarray. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, dark circles shadowed her eyes, and she wore what appeared to be the same clothes from the photo she'd sent. But it was the raw fear in her expression that truly alarmed him. "Claire," he managed, his voice a rasp that triggered a coughing fit. She quickly helped him sip water through a straw, her hand trembling against the plastic cup. "Thank God," she whispered, pressing her forehead briefly against his arm. "You've been unconscious for nearly 40 hours. "Marcus?" he asked, dreading the answer. Claire's eyes filled with tears. I'm so sorry, Alex. He didn't make it. The news hit him with physical force. Marcus had a wife, 2 teenage daughters he'd been saving for their college funds. Alexander had meant to speak with him about establishing a Blackwood Technologies scholarship for them. What happened? He asked, trying to piece together the fragmented memories of the crash. Before Claire could answer, the door opened to admit a woman in a white coat, her dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples, her expression containing the practiced neutrality of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news. Mr. Blackwood, I'm Dr. Reeves, head of neurosurgery. It's good to see you awake. She approached the bed, picking up the chart. Do you remember what happened? The helicopter crashed, he said. I remember the impact, then nothing clear after that. Dr. Reeves nodded, making a note. That's consistent with traumatic injury. Mr. Blackwood, you sustained multiple serious injuries in the crash, including a severe trauma to your thoracic spine. Alexander felt Claire's hand slip into his, squeezing tightly. He suddenly knew, with terrible clarity, why he couldn't feel his legs. We performed emergency surgery to stabilize your spine and prevent further damage, Dr. Reeves continued, her voice gentle but matter-of-fact. However, the spinal cord was severely compromised at the T10-T12 level. Meaning? Alexander asked, though he already understood the implications. Meaning you have complete paraplegia below the level of injury. You will not have functional movement or sensation in your legs. The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that would reshape the landscape of his entire life. Alexander stared at the doctor, waiting for more. For the but, for the however, for the silver lining that his money and influence could surely purchase. Is it temporary? He asked, voice steady despite the chaos erupting within him. Dr. Reeves's expression softened slightly. The damage is permanent, Mr. Blackwood. With extensive rehabilitation, you'll learn to navigate life with a wheelchair, but you will not walk again. The finality of her statement crashed through him like a physical blow. Alexander Blackwood, who scaled mountains for recreation, who ran marathons, who had always dominated every room not just with his intellect, but with his physical presence, would never stand again. Never walk Claire down the aisle. Never dance with her at their wedding. Never carry her across the threshold of their home. He turned to Claire, expecting to see disappointment, perhaps even revulsion. How could she still want him? How could she tie herself to half a man, to someone who would now be a burden rather than a partner? But what he saw in her eyes was not pity, not disgust. It was fierce, protective love, mingled with relief so profound it bordered on reverence. You're alive, she whispered, voice breaking. When they called me about the crash, they said. She stopped, unable to give voice to what they had initially told her. But you survived, Alex. We'll figure out the rest together. Alexander wanted to believe her, wanted to draw strength from her unwavering gaze. But as Dr. Reeves continued discussing treatment plans, rehabilitation options, and the long road ahead, he felt himself retreating inward, away from Claire's touch, away from the future they had planned. The wedding, he said suddenly, interrupting the doctor mid-sentence. It's supposed to be the day after tomorrow. Claire leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. We'll reschedule. Everything can wait until you're better. But Alexander knew, with devastating clarity, that better would never again mean what it once had. As sunset painted the hospital room in hues of amber and gold, the same colors that had illuminated the helipad before his fall, he gazed out the window at a New York skyline that suddenly seemed as distant and unreachable as the life he had intended to lead. Blackwood Estate sprawled across 50 acres of pristine Westchester countryside. Its Georgian architecture and manicured gardens featured in architectural digests and society magazines. The master suite, redesigned by Claire, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the vineyard, had always been Alexander's sanctuary after grueling board meetings and international flights. Now, 8 weeks after the crash, it had become his prison. Rain pelted against the windows and sheets, the late November storm matching Alexander's mood as he sat in his wheelchair, watching water cascade down glass like tears he refused to shed. Behind him, a team of contractors measured doorways and discussed the installation of ramps and accessible bathroom fixtures. The conversation washed over him in meaningless waves, details of a life he had not chosen, adaptations to an existence he did not want. Mr. Blackwood, ventured the lead contractor, a stocky man named Rivera who specialized in accessibility renovations. We need your input on the shower design. There are several options that would... Ask Miss Edwards, Alexander interrupted, not turning from the window. She's handling the renovations. The man exchanged an uncomfortable glance with his colleague. Miss Edwards specifically asked that we consult with you on the personal spaces. She said it's important that the modifications reflect your preferences. Alexander finally turned, fixing the contractor with the same penetrating stare that had intimidated countless business rivals. My preference would be to stand in my own shower, Mr. Rivera. Since that's not possible, the details are irrelevant. A tense silence followed, broken only by the soft clearing of a throat from the doorway. Alexander didn't need to look to know Claire had arrived, likely having heard his caustic response. He could picture her expression perfectly, concern shadowed by exhaustion, patience fraying but still intact. "Could you give us a moment?" she asked the contractors, her voice carrying the same gentle authority she used when directing museum staff during exhibition installations. As the men filed out, Claire entered the room. Today she wore slim-fitting jeans and an oversized cashmere sweater in deep burgundy, one of his favorites on her. Her hair was twisted into a loose knot at the nape of her neck, tendrils escaping to frame her face. Despite the casual attire, she looked elegant, put together. Everything Alexander no longer felt. "That was unnecessary," she said quietly, approaching his wheelchair. "What was unnecessary was asking me to choose between shower benches, when the entire exercise is a reminder of what I've lost," he replied, the words emerging sharper than he'd intended. Claire flinched, almost imperceptibly, but continued her approach until she stood directly before him. She knelt, placing herself at eye level, a gesture he recognized as deliberate, one of many adaptations she'd made without drawing attention to them. "Alex," she said, her voice steady despite the hurt evident in her eyes. "I understand this is hell for you, but those men are trying to help make your life easier." "Easier?" Alexander laughed bitterly. "Nothing about this is easy, Claire. Not for me, and certainly not for you." He wheeled himself away from her, toward the antique desk that had been lowered to accommodate his wheelchair. On its surface sat stacks of medical journals, research papers on spinal cord injuries, and experimental treatment protocols. A testament to his methodical approach to problems, even personal catastrophes. "I spoke with Dr. Hiroshi in Tokyo this morning," he said, his back to Claire. "He's developing a neural implant that's shown promise in restoring limited mobility in cases similar to mine." Claire sighed, and he could hear the soft pad of her feet on the carpet as she moved to stand beside him. "And what did he say?" "That I'm an excellent candidate for the clinical trial beginning next year." "That's potentially good news," Claire said, cautiously. She'd learned to navigate these conversations carefully, balancing between encouragement and realistic expectations. "It's a false hope wrapped in scientific jargon," Alexander replied flatly, pushing aside the papers. "Even in the best-case scenario, we're talking about minimal functional improvement years from now." Claire reached out, her fingers hovering near his shoulder before making contact, a hesitation that spoke volumes about how their physical relationship had changed. Where once she would touch him freely, confidently, now there was uncertainty, caution. "There are other ways to measure improvement, Alex," she said softly. "When I left yesterday, you couldn't transfer from bed to chair without assistance. This morning, Marcus told me you did it on your own." Marcus, not to be confused with his late pilot, was the live-in physical therapist Alexander had hired, a former Paralympic athlete whose no-nonsense approach occasionally broke through Alexander's wall of resentment. "A triumph worthy of headlines," Alexander muttered. "Billionaire successfully sits up by himself." Claire withdrew her hand, a flicker of hurt crossing her features before she squared her shoulders. "I know you're in pain. I know you're grieving. But I'm not your enemy, Alex." "No," he agreed, finally meeting her gaze. "You're the woman who was supposed to marry a man who could dance with her at their wedding, who could carry her over the threshold, who could father children without medical intervention. That man died in that helicopter, Claire." "I fell in love with you, not what you could do," Claire countered, an edge entering her voice. Your abilities were never what defined you to me. Easy to say now, when the reality is inescapable, Alexander responded. If you'd known this would happen, would you have still said yes when I proposed? The question hung between them, charged and dangerous. Claire's eyes narrowed slightly, her chin lifting in the stubborn gesture he'd once found so endearing. That's not fair, she said quietly. None of this is fair, he shot back, including the fact that you're chained to a relationship out of obligation and pity. Claire took a step back as if he'd struck her. For a moment, genuine anger flashed across her features, a rare emotion from someone who prided herself on measured responses. Is that what you think this is? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Obligation? Pity? Alexander turned away again, unwilling to face the hurt in her eyes. What else could it be? He asked, gesturing to his wheelchair. Look at me, Claire. Look at what you're signing up for. I am looking, she said, moving to stand in front of him again, forcing him to meet her gaze. I've been looking every day for the past 8 weeks, waiting for the man I love to look back at me instead of through me, to stop punishing us both for something neither of us could have prevented. Her words struck with precision, finding the vulnerable places beneath his armor of anger and self-pity. But Alexander couldn't allow himself to believe them, to believe that Claire's love could withstand the reality of their new circumstances. The what-ifs tormented him. What if she was staying out of duty? What if, years from now, she resented the life she had sacrificed to care for him? You should go, he said finally, his voice hollow. The museum needs you back. The world needs you back. And what about what I need? Claire challenged, tears finally spilling onto her cheeks. Have you asked me that once since the accident? The rawness of her emotion caught him off guard. Claire Edwards, composed, controlled Claire who could negotiate with temperamental artists and stubborn board members without breaking a sweat, was crying because of him, because he was pushing her away. What do you need, Claire? He asked quietly, a flicker of his former self breaking through the grief. She drew a shaky breath, brushing away tears with the back of her hand. I need my partner back. Not the man who could walk, but the man who could see possibilities where others saw obstacles. The man who listened when I spoke. The man who wasn't afraid to be vulnerable with me. Her words wrapped around his heart, squeezing painfully. That man felt as distant to Alexander as the ability to stand, a ghost of a former self, impossible to reclaim. I don't know how to be that person anymore, he admitted, the confession costing him dearly. Claire's expression softened, and she reached for his hand, entwining their fingers. Then maybe we discover who you are now, together. But you have to let me in, Alex. You have to stop deciding what's best for me without my input. A knock at the door interrupted the moment, followed by the appearance of Eliza, who had transitioned from running Alexander's office to managing his medical appointments and household in the weeks since the accident. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said, her professional demeanor firmly in place, despite the obvious tension in the room. But Dr. Sanjay is here for your appointment, Mr. Blackwood. Alexander withdrew his hand from Claire's, the fragile connection between them severing as he retreated once more behind walls of self-protection. Tell him, I'll be right there. As Eliza nodded and withdrew, Claire stood, wiping away the last traces of tears. We're having this conversation again later, she said, her tone making it clear this wasn't a request. I'll be back after my meeting at the museum. Alexander nodded, not trusting himself to speak. As Claire leaned down to kiss his cheek, another adaptation, another reminder of change, he inhaled the familiar scent of her perfume, jasmine and vanilla, with undertones of sandalwood. The same scent that had lingered on his pillows in the days after the accident when she'd barely left his side. After she departed, Alexander sat motionless, listening to the fading sound of her footsteps in the hallway. When silence returned, he wheeled himself to his desk and opened the bottom drawer, extracting a small velvet box. Inside lay the redesigned engagement ring, never presented, a symbol of promises he no longer felt worthy to make. He closed the box with a decisive snap, returning it to its hiding place before turning his wheelchair toward the door. Dr. Sanjay was waiting. Another appointment, another assessment, another clinical discussion of his new reality. Alexander Blackwood, master of the universe, reduced to measuring progress by the strength in his arms and the adaptability of his surroundings. The rehabilitation center occupied the east wing of Blackwood Estate, a space that had once housed Alexander's collection of rare first-edition books and architectural models. Now it contained state-of-the-art equipment shipped from Switzerland, a hydrotherapy pool, and monitoring systems that rivaled those of leading hospitals. Money couldn't restore his legs, but it could buy the best possible care within the privacy of his home. 10 more repetitions, Mr. Blackwood, Marcus encouraged, standing nearby as Alexander struggled through a series of upper body strengthening exercises. Sweat soaked through his moisture-wicking shirt, and his muscles trembled with exertion. "I said I need a break," Alexander growled, releasing the specialized weights. Marcus, a former Navy SEAL before a training accident had left him paraplegic, merely raised an eyebrow. 9 more repetitions, Mr. Blackwood, unless you'd prefer I call Miss Edwards and tell her you quit today's session early. It was a low blow, and both men knew it. Alexander glared at his therapist, recognizing the manipulation, but unable to resist its effectiveness. With a muttered curse, he gripped the weights again, forcing his body to comply through sheer determination. After completing the set, Alexander wheeled himself to the window, gulping water from a specialized bottle as he gazed out at the garden. The wedding pavilion had been dismantled weeks ago, but he could still see exactly where it had stood, where he and Claire were supposed to have exchanged vows under an archway of autumn blooms. "Miss Edwards mentioned you've been researching experimental treatments," Marcus commented, making notes on his tablet. "Know thy enemy," Alexander replied without turning. "Isn't that what they taught you in the military?" "They also taught me not to waste resources fighting battles that can't be won," Marcus countered. His frankness, one of the reasons Alexander tolerated him. "Some things can't be fixed, Mr. Blackwood. They can only be integrated." Alexander turned his wheelchair to face the therapist. "Easy philosophy when the alternatives are so limited." "Is it?" Marcus asked, crossing his muscular arms. "You think I didn't try every experimental treatment, every promised miracle when this first happened to me?" He gestured to his own legs, encased in specialized braces that allowed him limited supported standing. 15 years, Mr. Blackwood. 15 years chasing cures instead of living my life. You know what I got for it? Debt, disappointment, and lost time." "Our situations are hardly comparable," Alexander said dismissively. "I have the resources to pursue options unavailable to most people." "Money doesn't change the laws of medicine or biology," Marcus replied evenly. "But sure, chase your miracles. Just don't be surprised when the cost isn't measured in dollars." The conversation might have continued, but Dr. Sanjay entered, tablet in hand, ready for Alexander's weekly neurological assessment. Marcus nodded respectfully to the doctor before departing, leaving Alexander with the distinct impression that he'd somehow failed a test more important than any physical exercise. Hours later, after enduring poking, prodding, and a battery of questions about sensation and function, Alexander retreated to his study. The room had been one of the first to be modified after his return home. Doorways widened, furniture rearranged, desk height adjusted. Yet it still felt foreign, as if it belonged to someone else. The rain had stopped, leaving the landscape beyond his windows glistening in the late afternoon light. On the desk before him sat a folder containing the latest reports from Blackwood Technologies. In the weeks since the accident, he had gradually re-engaged with the company, conducting virtual meetings and reviewing quarterly projections. Work, the familiar territory of strategic planning and executive decisions, offered a respite from the alien landscape of his physical rehabilitation. He was deep into a financial analysis when a soft knock interrupted his concentration. Expecting Eliza with his evening medication, he called, "Come in." Instead, it was Claire who entered, still dressed in the outfit she'd worn to the museum, but with her hair now loose around her shoulders. She carried a large flat package wrapped in brown paper. "You're back early," Alexander commented, setting aside the report. "I thought your meeting would run later." "I rescheduled the afternoon appointments," Claire replied, moving further into the room. "Some things are more important." Alexander tensed, preparing for a continuation of their earlier emotional conversation. Instead, Claire placed the wrapped package on the desk before him. "What's this?" he asked, eyeing it suspiciously. "Open it and see." With reluctant curiosity, Alexander tore away the paper to reveal a canvas. The painting was abstract, bold strokes of midnight blue and black, intersected with veins of gold and crimson. Despite its apparent chaos, there was a harmony to the composition, a sense of order emerging from disorder. Something about it resonated with him immediately, though he couldn't articulate why. "It's called Fracture," Claire said quietly. "The artist is a woman named Sophia Lynn. She was a professional dancer until a car accident left her paralyzed from the chest down. This was the first work she created after learning to paint with her mouth." Alexander stared at the canvas, suddenly seeing it through new eyes. The bold strokes, the decisive lines, evidence of tremendous effort and adaptation. He ran his fingers lightly over the textured surface, feeling the ridges of paint that testified to the artist's determination. "It's extraordinary," he said honestly. "It's the centerpiece of a new exhibition I'm curating," Claire continued, perching on the edge of his desk, close, but not crowding him. "Artists who created their most significant work after life-altering accidents or illnesses." Alexander looked up at her, understanding dawning. "You're doing this because of me." Claire shook her head, her copper hair catching the fading daylight. "I started researching this concept 6 months ago, long before the accident. But yes, it's taken on new meaning now." She paused, her fingers lightly touching the edge of the canvas. These artists didn't stop creating when their bodies changed. They found new ways to express themselves. The implication was clear, and Alexander felt a familiar resistance rising within him. "I'm not an artist, Claire." "No," she agreed. "But you are a creator. You've built companies, technologies, solutions to problems others couldn't solve." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes holding his. "That mind, the mind I fell in love with, hasn't changed, Alex." Something shifted in Alexander's chest, not the dramatic epiphany of movies, but a small, almost imperceptible crack in the wall of grief he'd constructed around himself. He looked again at the painting, seeing beyond the technical skill to the resilience it represented. "She could have given up," he said quietly. "Yes," Claire agreed. "Many do. But the ones who find a way forward, they're the ones who inspire others." She reached across the desk, her fingers lightly touching his. "They're the ones who change the world, not despite their limitations, but because they've learned to see differently." Alexander didn't pull away from her touch, allowing the warmth of her fingers to anchor him in the moment. "I don't know if I can be that person, Claire." "You already are," she replied simply. "You just can't see it yet." The conversation might have deepened further, but Alexander's phone chimed with an incoming video call, the specialist from Switzerland he'd scheduled a consultation with. Claire withdrew her hand, recognizing the signal of another boundary being established. "I should let you take that," she said, standing. "Will you join me for dinner afterward? Chef René is making that wild mushroom risotto you like." The invitation, so normal, so reminiscent of their life before, caught Alexander off guard. For weeks, he had taken meals alone in his room or study, avoiding the intimacy of shared meals and conversation. He began, then stopped, seeing the hope in Claire's eyes. A small concession, perhaps, but one he could make. "Yes, I'd like that." The smile that illuminated her face made something within him ache with recognition, a glimpse of what he stood to lose if he continued pushing her away. As she departed, Alexander turned his attention to the incoming call, but his gaze kept returning to Sophia Lynn's painting. Fracture. A word that described destruction, yet the canvas before him spoke not of endings, but of transformation. For the first time since the accident, Alexander allowed himself to consider the possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, there might be a life worth living on the other side of his grief. Dinner had been surprisingly comfortable. Conversation limited to neutral topics, like Claire's exhibition and developments at Blackwood Technologies. Yet as they shared tiramisu and coffee in the estate's solarium, Alexander felt the protective numbness he'd cultivated begin to thin, exposing raw edges of emotion he'd fought to suppress. "James Chen called today," he said, setting down his coffee cup. James was his closest friend and the company's chief innovation officer. He wants to bring the executive team here next week to discuss the Singapore expansion. Claire nodded, tucking her legs beneath her on the sofa. That's a good sign. They miss your leadership. Or they're checking if I'm still competent to provide it, Alexander replied, the bitterness he'd mostly kept at bay during dinner seeping back into his voice. Alex, Claire began, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. Don't patronize me, Claire. We both know how quickly the business world discards damaged goods. Claire's expression hardened slightly. Is that how you see yourself? As damaged goods? The direct question hung between them, demanding an answer. Alexander wasn't sure he could articulate. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. Glancing at the screen, he saw a message from Eliza regarding a time-sensitive contract that required his electronic signature. I need to handle this, he said, grateful for the interruption. It's the Tokyo Agreement. Claire nodded, though disappointment flickered across her features. Of course, I should get some rest anyway. I have an early meeting tomorrow. As she stood to leave, Alexander was struck by an inexplicable desire to prolong her presence. Claire, he called as she reached the doorway. She turned, eyebrows raised in question. Thank you, for the painting, and for dinner. A small smile curved her lips. You're welcome. Good night, Alex. After she departed, Alexander remained in the solarium, surrounded by exotic plants that thrived in the controlled environment of the glass-enclosed space. Outside, darkness had fallen completely, transforming the windows into mirrors that reflected his image back at him. A man in a wheelchair, alone in a room designed for beauty and growth. The irony wasn't lost on him. Wheeling himself toward his study to complete the contract review, Alexander paused at an antique side table that held a collection of framed photographs. Among them was an image taken the previous summer in Greece. He and Claire standing on the deck of his yacht, the Aegean Sea stretching endlessly behind them. His arm was around her waist, her head tilted against his shoulder, both of them sun-bronzed and laughing. He picked up the frame, studying their expressions. The happiness captured in that moment seemed to belong to different people. Carefree, untroubled by the realities that now defined their existence. As he replaced the photograph, his gaze fell on another image, partially hidden behind the others. With a sense of masochistic curiosity, he drew it forward. It was a candid shot taken at the charity gala where they'd first met. Claire in that midnight blue vintage Dior, Alexander in black tie, both caught in profile during what appeared to be an intense conversation. Neither was smiling, yet there was an unmistakable energy between them, a magnetic pull, visible even in the frozen moment. Looking at it now, Alexander realized what had drawn him to Claire from the beginning wasn't physical attraction alone, but her mind, her unflinching honesty, her passionate opinions, her refusal to be impressed by his wealth or influence. None of those qualities had anything to do with his ability to walk. The revelation wasn't earth-shattering. It didn't suddenly erase his grief or frustration, but it planted a seed, a possibility that perhaps Claire's continued presence in his life wasn't motivated by pity or obligation, but by the same connection that had drawn them together in the first place. As he continued toward his study, that seed of possibility took tentative root in the landscape of his altered life. Not quite hope, but perhaps its precursor. For the first time since the accident, Alexander Blackwood considered that the man he had been might not be entirely lost, but rather waiting to be rediscovered in a different form. Spring had transformed the Blackwood estate, bathing the grounds in soft green light filtered through newly budded leaves. Cherry blossoms drifted like pale confetti across the lawn, where gardeners prepared flower beds for summer blooms. In the 6 months since the accident, nature had completed an entire cycle of death and rebirth, an irony not lost on Alexander as he navigated his wheelchair along the smooth stone path toward the vineyard. His body had changed too. Hours of rehabilitation had sculpted his upper body into a form more powerful than before. His shoulders and arms now rippling with the muscle definition that came from relying on them for mobility. He had grown his hair slightly longer, and a neatly trimmed beard framed his jaw, small changes that somehow reflected the internal transformation still underway. The Malbec vines are showing exceptional progress this year, remarked Paolo, the vineyard manager, walking alongside him. We may have our best vintage yet. Good, Alexander replied, pausing to examine a cluster of tiny green fruit just beginning to form. Increase the production estimates by 20%. I want to have enough to launch the charitable foundation with a limited edition release." Paolo nodded, making notes on his tablet. "And the name for this vintage, sir?" Alexander ran his fingers over the delicate vine, remembering how Claire had once described wine as art you can taste, history, geography, and human ingenuity in a single sip. "Phoenix," he said finally. "We'll call it Phoenix." As Paolo departed to oversee the day's work, Alexander continued along the path that wound through the vineyard rows. He breathed deeply, savoring the earthy scent of soil warming in the spring sunshine. 6 months ago, he would have considered this simple pleasure insignificant. Now, he recognized it as a gift, one of many he had nearly refused to accept. His phone vibrated with an incoming message. Glancing at the screen, he saw Dr. Hiroshi's name and felt a familiar tightening in his chest. The experimental treatment protocol in Tokyo had moved forward, but without him as a participant. After weeks of soul-searching conversations with Claire, with Marcus, and finally with himself, Alexander had decided against pursuing the risky procedure with its minimal chance of success. It had been one of the hardest decisions of his life, the formal abandonment of hope for physical recovery. Yet paradoxically, it had also been liberating, an acceptance that had allowed him to redirect his energy from chasing an elusive cure to rebuilding a life worth living. The message contained the preliminary results from the first human trials. Alexander scanned them quickly, recognizing that even the modest outcomes would once have seemed miraculous to him. Now they simply confirmed he had made the right choice. He typed a brief, gracious response, wishing the research team continued success, before pocketing the phone and continuing his journey. At the far end of the vineyard stood a newly constructed glass pavilion, a modernist structure of steel and transparent walls that seemed to float above the landscape. It had been Claire's idea, a permanent replacement for the wedding venue that had been dismantled after the accident. But unlike the traditional white tent that had been planned for their original ceremony, this was a multi-purpose space designed to serve as an art gallery, concert venue, and community gathering place. As Alexander approached, he could see activity inside. Workers installing track lighting, technicians testing the state-of-the-art sound system. The building was scheduled to open the following weekend with Claire's exhibition, Transformed, Art After Adversity. In the months since she had shown him Sophia Lynn's painting, the exhibition had grown from concept to reality, featuring works by 23 artists who had created meaningful art after life-altering injuries or illnesses. Alexander had surprised himself by becoming deeply involved in the project, leveraging his business connections to secure rare works and funding to bring artists from around the world for the opening. What had begun as Claire's professional project had evolved into something they built together, their first true collaboration since the accident. "Mr. Blackwood," called a voice, interrupting his thoughts. He turned to see Eliza approaching, tablet in hand as always. "The board members are assembled in the conference room for the quarterly review. Miss Edwards asked me to remind you about lunch afterward." Alexander nodded, checking his watch. "Thank you, Eliza. Please tell them I'll be there in 10 minutes. As his chief of staff departed, Alexander took a final moment to appreciate the pavilion silhouetted against the spring sky. It seemed fitting somehow, a transparent structure where nothing was hidden, where light penetrated every corner. So different from the opaque walls he had constructed around himself in the early days after the accident. The journey back to the main house took him past the rehabilitation wing, where he still spent 2 hours each morning. Through the windows, he could see Marcus working with a new client, a young woman recently injured in a skiing accident. Alexander had established a foundation to provide high-quality rehabilitation services to those who couldn't afford them, with Marcus serving as both clinical director and living testament to what was possible. Inside, the house hummed with activity. In recent weeks, Alexander had gradually reopened the estate, allowing the staff to return to their duties, inviting colleagues and friends to visit. The isolation he had imposed in the aftermath of the accident had slowly dissolved as he re-engaged with the world, not as he had before, but in new ways that accommodated his changed circumstances. The conference room had been redesigned with his input. the massive mahogany table replaced with a rounded, more accessible version, the chairs selected for comfort during long meetings, the technology upgraded to facilitate his leadership. Alexander entered with confidence, nodding to the assembled board members who rose respectfully at his arrival. "Good morning," he greeted them, navigating to his position at the head of the table. "I apologize for the delay. Let's begin with the quarterly financials." For the next 2 hours, Alexander was entirely in his element, analyzing projections, challenging assumptions, making decisive calls on strategic initiatives. This aspect of his life, at least, remained largely unchanged. His mind, always his greatest asset, continued to function with the same incisive clarity that had built his fortune. What had changed was his perspective. Where once he had driven himself and others relentlessly toward greater profits and market domination, he now found himself asking different questions. How would this technology improve lives? Was this approach sustainable? Did this initiative reflect the values he wanted his company to embody? As the meeting concluded and the board members departed, James Chen, his friend and innovation chief, lingered behind. "The Singapore expansion is proceeding ahead of schedule," James reported, taking a seat across from Alexander. "And the Adaptive Technology Division has already secured 3 patents for the accessibility interfaces." Alexander nodded, pleased but not surprised. The Adaptive Technology Division was his newest initiative, born directly from his experience after the accident. Recognizing the shortcomings in existing accessibility technology, he had redirected significant R&D resources toward creating better solutions, from more intuitive wheelchair controls to seamless home automation systems designed specifically for people with mobility limitations. "And how are things with you?" James asked, his tone shifting from professional to personal. "You seem better." Alexander considered the question, recognizing the euphemism for what it was. Better than what? Better than the bitter, angry man who had emerged from the hospital? Better than the recluse who had shut out friends and colleagues? Better than the broken shell who had tried to push away the woman he loved? "I am better," he acknowledged simply. "Not the same, but better." James nodded, understanding the distinction. "And Claire? How are things between you?" Alexander's hand moved instinctively to his jacket pocket, where a small velvet box had taken up residence once again. "We're finding our way forward," he said. "Together." After James departed, Alexander checked the time and navigated toward the solarium, where Claire had arranged for their lunch. As he approached, he could hear her voice, animated, passionate, and realized she was on a phone call. He paused at the threshold, not wanting to interrupt. "Yes, absolutely. We can accommodate the additional sculptures," she was saying, pacing before the wall of windows that overlooked the garden. "The pavilion has plenty of space, and I agree they'll create a powerful dialogue with Lynn's paintings." She was dressed for work in a tailored pantsuit the color of ripe plums, her copper hair twisted into an elegant chignon. As she turned, gesturing expressively while she spoke, sunlight caught the planes of her face, highlighting the delicate architecture of her cheekbones and the determined set of her jaw. Alexander watched her, struck anew by her beauty, her intelligence, her unwavering determination. In the darkest days after the accident, he had convinced himself that she stayed out of duty or pity. Only gradually had he allowed himself to recognize the truth. Claire remained because she chose to, because the connection between them transcended his physical condition. She ended her call and turned, spotting him in the doorway. Her face transformed with a smile that still had the power to accelerate his heartbeat. "How long have you been lurking there?" she asked, approaching to place a gentle kiss on his lips. "Long enough to be reminded how fortunate I am," he replied, reaching for her hand. Claire's expression softened as she entwined her fingers with his. "The board meeting went well?" "Very well. The Adaptive Technology Division is exceeding all projections." "Of course it is," Claire said, leading him toward the table where lunch awaited. "You understand the needs better than anyone. That's the silver lining in all this, isn't it? You're creating solutions that will help thousands of people." Alexander considered her words as they settled at the table. A silver lining, such a delicate euphemism for the catastrophic event that had reshaped his existence. Yet there was truth in what she said. His accident had redirected not just his personal life, but his professional legacy toward something more meaningful than mere wealth accumulation. "I've been thinking about the foundation," he said, as Claire served the chilled soup that began their meal. "I want to expand its scope beyond rehabilitation services." "Oh?" Claire's eyebrows lifted in interest. "What did you have in mind?" "Educational opportunities for people with disabilities, seed funding for entrepreneurs developing accessibility solutions, cultural grants for projects like your exhibition." He paused, watching her reaction. "I'd like you to consider taking a leadership role in shaping the cultural initiatives." Claire set down her spoon, studying him with a mixture of surprise and assessment. "Are you offering me a job, Mr. Blackwood?" "I'm proposing a partnership," he clarified. "Your expertise in the art world, combined with the Foundation's resources, could create something extraordinary." "A partnership," Claire repeated, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Interesting choice of words. Alexander felt a flutter of nervousness, an uncommon sensation for a man once known for his unshakable confidence. "Claire." "Yes," she interrupted, reaching across the table to take his hand. "Yes to the Foundation partnership, and yes to whatever else you might be working up the courage to ask." Alexander blinked, momentarily nonplussed. "How did you?" Claire's smile widened. "You've been carrying a small box in your jacket pocket for 3 weeks, Alex. I wasn't sure if you were ever going to use it." A startled laugh escaped him. Genuine, unguarded amusement that felt like another step in his ongoing recovery. "I had a whole speech prepared," he admitted, "about how much I've changed, about how grateful I am that you stayed, about how I understand if you want a different future than what we planned." Claire's expression grew serious. "And what if I don't want a different future? What if I still want you, exactly as you are now?" Alexander withdrew the velvet box from his pocket, opening it to reveal the constellation ring he had designed before the accident, the one never presented at the rehearsal dinner that never occurred. "Then I would ask you, Claire Edwards, if you would do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife, not because you feel obligated, not because you pity me, but because you choose me, the man I am now, not the man I was." Claire looked from the ring to his face, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "The man you are now is the man I've always loved, Alex. The exterior packaging has changed, but the essence remains." She extended her left hand. "And yes, I choose you, today and every day." As Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger, where it had always been destined to rest, he felt something expand within his chest. Not the bitter resignation he had initially mistaken for acceptance, not the cautious optimism that had followed, but something deeper, more substantial. Happiness, perhaps, or peace. Or simply the recognition that some forms of love truly were beyond bounds, capable of transcending tragedy, of adapting to new realities, of finding beauty in unexpected places. "The pavilion opens next Saturday," Claire said, admiring how the ring caught the light. "Would that be too soon?" Alexander understood immediately what she was suggesting. "For the wedding, you mean?" She nodded, a hint of mischief in her smile. "Why wait? We've already lost enough time." The old Alexander might have insisted on a grand affair, something worthy of their social standing, something that made a statement to the world. But the man he had become recognized the wisdom in Claire's suggestion. They had already navigated the most difficult terrain together. Why delay the formal acknowledgement of what they already knew? "Next Saturday it is," he agreed. "Though my mother will be scandalized by the lack of proper invitations." Claire laughed, the sound as bright and clear as the spring day surrounding them. "We'll blame it on your impulsive nature." As they continued their lunch, making plans for the ceremony that would finally unite them officially, Alexander found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. The helicopter crash had indeed changed everything, but not in the way he had initially feared. Rather than destroying his future, it had redirected him toward one with different contours but equal meaning. The path had been neither straight nor easy. There had been dark days when he'd believed himself unworthy of Claire's love, broken beyond repair. There had been moments of rage against the circumstances that had altered his life without his consent. There had been grief for the man he had been, for the wedding they had planned, for the future they had envisioned. But through it all, Claire had remained, not as a caretaker or a martyr, but as a partner. She had given him space when he needed it, challenged him when he deserved it, and loved him consistently through all of it. In return, he had gradually found his way back to her, different but whole, changed but not diminished. "What are you thinking about?" Claire asked, noticing his momentary distraction. Alexander smiled, squeezing her hand where it rested in his. "I'm thinking that sometimes the most profound journeys are the ones we never plan to take." The pavilion glowed like a lantern against the twilight sky, its glass walls illuminated from within, revealing glimpses of the art exhibition now installed in its central gallery. Outside, the vineyard stretched in neat rows, while paper lanterns marked the winding path that guests would follow to the ceremony. In a suite within the main house, Alexander adjusted his bow tie, surveying his reflection in the full-length mirror. The custom-tailored tuxedo had been designed specifically for a seated position, ensuring impeccable lines despite his wheelchair. His hair was neatly trimmed, his beard precisely shaped, his eyes clear and focused. "Very elegant, sir," commented Lawrence, his valet, stepping back to assess the overall effect. "Quite striking." "Thank you, Lawrence," Alexander replied, making a final adjustment to his cufflinks, the ones Claire had given him long ago, with their intertwined branch design that seemed even more meaningful now. "Is everything ready?" "Indeed, sir. The guests are arriving and the string quartet has begun playing. Miss Edwards is in the East Wing with her attendants." Alexander nodded, a flutter of anticipation replacing the nervous tension that had accompanied him throughout the day. After dismissing Lawrence, he wheeled himself to the window, gazing out at the gathering dusk. Stars were just beginning to appear, including, he noted with a smile, the constellation Cassiopeia, visible low on the horizon. The same stars embedded in Claire's ring, the same pattern that had watched over their first meeting. A knock at the door heralded James's arrival. Impeccable in his own tuxedo. "Ready, my friend? Your bride awaits." "More ready than I've ever been," Alexander replied with complete honesty. Together they made their way through the house and along the illuminated path toward the pavilion. Guests already occupied the chairs arranged in a semicircle before the glass structure, their faces familiar and welcome. Colleagues who had supported his return to leadership, friends who had given him space to heal without withdrawing their affection, family members who had learned to interact with him naturally despite his changed circumstances. In the front row sat his mother, elegant in midnight blue, beside Claire's father, both of them beaming with obvious pride and happiness. Nearby was Marcus in a well-cut suit, alongside several patients from the rehabilitation program, including the young woman Alexander had glimpsed months earlier, now making remarkable progress in her own recovery journey. As Alexander took his position before the assembled guests, the string quartet transitioned to Pachelbel's canon. Claire's choice, traditional yet timeless. A hush fell over the gathering as all eyes turned toward the path, where a vision in ivory appeared, illuminated by the soft glow of lantern light. Claire's dress was a masterpiece of understatement, a simple column of silk that floated around her like mist, its only adornments a delicate beaded trim and the subtle constellation pattern embroidered along its edges in silver thread. Her copper hair was arranged in loose waves crowned with a wreath of tiny white flowers. She carried a small bouquet of calla lilies, their elegant simplicity a perfect complement to her unadorned beauty. As she processed toward him, escorted by her younger brother Michael, Alexander felt his chest tighten with emotion. This woman, this extraordinary, brilliant, compassionate woman, had chosen him. Not the billionaire who had pursued her, not the physical specimen he had once been, but the man he had become through fire and loss, and ultimately redemption. When she reached him, Claire handed her bouquet to her friend and maid of honor, Lucia, before turning to face Alexander. Their eyes met, and the rest of the world seemed to recede, leaving only the two of them in a moment suspended between past and future. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, traditional vows enhanced by personal promises they had written separately, and now spoke with clear, unwavering voices. "Claire," Alexander began, taking her hands in his, "before I met you, I measured success in acquisitions and achievements. You taught me to see beyond balance sheets to the immeasurable wealth of genuine connection. when tragedy altered the course of our lives, I tried to release you from promises made to a different man. But you refused to be dismissed. A ripple of appreciative laughter moved through the assembled guests. You saw me, truly saw me, even when I couldn't see myself. You waited while I found my way back to you, changed but not diminished, different but not less. Today, I promise to love you with the same unwavering commitment you have shown me. I promise to be your partner in all things, to support your dreams as you have supported mine, and to build a future with you that honors the journey that brought us here. Claire's eyes shimmered with tears as she listened, her hands steady in his. When it was her turn to speak, her voice was clear and strong, carrying across the twilight garden. Alexander, when we first met, I accused you of trying to buy cultural relevance. More laughter from the guests. You responded not with offense, but with curiosity. And in that moment, I glimpsed the man beneath the billionaire facade. The man I stand before today. Our path has not been the one we planned, but it has revealed the depth and resilience of our connection. In your darkest moments, when you tried to push me away for what you believed was my own good, I refused to go because I knew what you couldn't yet see. That our love was never defined by your ability to walk, but by our ability to walk together through whatever life presents. Today, I promise to continue that journey with you, to be your wife, your partner, your co-conspirator in creating a life of meaning and purpose. I promise to love you not despite our challenges, but including them, acknowledging that they have shaped us into who we are today. Two people stronger together than apart, ready to face whatever comes next, side by side. As they exchanged rings, his sized to match her constellation design, Alexander felt the final pieces of his fragmented self reunite into something new. Not a restoration of what had been, but an integration of past and present into a more complex, more compassionate whole. By the power vested in me, concluded the officiant, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Alexander reached for Claire, who leaned down without hesitation, meeting his lips in a kiss that sealed their promises and marked the beginning of their official life together. The guests erupted in applause, but Alexander barely heard them, lost in the moment of connection that transcended all physical limitations. As Claire straightened, she kept her hand in his, turning with him to face their friends and family as a married couple at last. Together, they led the procession into the pavilion, where the exhibition space had been transformed for the evening into a reception venue unlike any other. Surrounded by the artwork Claire had curated, each piece a testament to human resilience and creativity in the face of profound challenge, they celebrated not just their marriage, but the journey that had brought them to this moment. A journey neither had chosen, but both had ultimately embraced. Hours later, as the celebration continued around them, Alexander found a quiet moment with his new wife in a corner of the pavilion. Above them hung Sophia Lynn's Fracture, the painting that had first cracked his protective shell of bitterness after the accident. Happy? Claire asked, perching on his lap as she had learned to do with natural ease, her arms draped comfortably around his shoulders. Alexander considered the question, looking past her to the gathered guests, to the exhibition that surrounded them, to the life they had begun to build together. Beyond words, he replied honestly. You? Claire's smile held all the warmth and promise of their future together. Completely. She glanced up at the painting. It's remarkable, isn't it? How something beautiful can emerge from brokenness. Indeed, Alexander agreed, thinking not of the artwork but of the journey they had navigated together. Though I've come to believe that perhaps we're never truly broken, just transformed. As the evening progressed into night, stars appeared in full brilliance through the glass ceiling of the pavilion, countless points of light in the vast darkness, including the distinctive W shape of Cassiopeia, watching over them as it had from the beginning. Alexander Blackwood, once defined by his ability to stand at the pinnacle of his world, found himself paradoxically more complete seated in his wheelchair with Claire at his side. The accident had taken much from him, but, in its aftermath, he had gained something beyond price. The knowledge that true love, like the human spirit itself, could not be bound by physical limitations, that it could adapt, transform, and ultimately transcend whatever obstacles fate placed in its path. As he and Claire greeted their guests, accepted congratulations, and shared in the joy of their celebration, Alexander recognized that they had indeed found their way to the future they were meant to have. Different from what they had planned, but no less rich, no less meaningful, no less filled with possibility. It was, in every sense that mattered, a love beyond bounds.